Good afternoon. My name is Dr. Eric Turing. I'm the Senior Vice President for the American College of Veterinary Preventive Medicine, and I want to welcome you all to today's webinar. The webinar today is for our partner organizations, the American College of Veterinary Preventive Medicine, the American Association of Food Safety and Public Health Veterinarians, the U.S. Animal Health Association, and the National Association of Federal Veterinarians. I want to welcome our speaker today. Dr. Fannenstiel, Michelle Fannenstiel, is a graduate of the University of Georgia College of Veterinary Medicine. She's worked in regulatory medicine as an entrepreneur since leaving her post in the United States Army. She combines regulatory work, life, trauma, and business coaching to create stronger and more profitable food businesses. She lives in Ohio with her family and is the CEO of Dirgo Food Safety. Dr. Fannenstiel offers this work to food enterprises up and down the value chain through her Food Safety University family of products. So welcome, Dr. Michelle Fannenstiel.
Thank you so much, Dr. Turing. It's wonderful to be here, everybody. I am super glad that you've chosen to spend this afternoon with me. Today we're going to be talking about a methodology of doing risk mitigation up and down the value chain that I teach my students. I guess part of my bio is I said I'm an adjunct at Johns Hopkins. And I teach, and I mostly do this with my customers to help them pass audits, which y'all may know a thing or two about. So here's the way that we're going to do this. I have some slides today. And if you would like the templates for an actual plan and a video how to use them, send me an email. My email's at the end of probably the last slide. But right now we're going to be doing some thinking and that sort of thing, and you'll see why as we get through the slides. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to share my screen, and we will get ourselves going here. All right, so. Okay, so my guess is absolutely no idea. So I've never heard of anybody do this in any way, the way that I have done it. But one of the things about me, right, is that I came as Dr. Turing said, I came up through the Army system, right? I was posted to Fort Monmouth and I was cadre at West Point for a while. And I was really a food inspection post. And I spent, as I was telling like a new client, I spent a lot of time crawling through basements in Brooklyn looking at things. And I really brought my captain's job into a consulting company because I deeply believe that food security is national security, and doing really good risk mitigation around economically motivated adulteration is incredibly important so that we can have the food economies that we all want and deserve. So why are we here today? Well, we're here to talk about, how we can do that actual risk mitigation through something I call the 4 food safety basics. Okay. And we're going to walk through those basics. And these are, and I mean, when I say basic, I mean really, really basic. And we're going to walk through this VACCP planning so that you can understand them, and then utilize this framework to assess the risk of the plants that you're regulating or that you're auditing or that you're working in, right? And it doesn't actually just, I mean, this is very food production specific, but the framework itself, these 4 basics, you can take, I mean, not kidding, use them with my kids. So speaking of these things, so what do we mean by vulnerabilities? Okay, we have a lot of vulnerabilities in our workspaces. Okay, and there are lots of different ways we can think about this. A vulnerability assessment for critical control points, or a VACCP plan, addresses these. But the idea is that we think more broadly, okay? And I want you to take a moment, and I hope you like, I probably should have started with this, but one, I'm a Yankee and I talk fast, and two, we don't go anywhere without a pen and paper, right? So I want you to take a moment and I want you to think for yourself, and this can be any answer, and if you want to pop these in the chat, that's fine. But what's your biggest vulnerability at work? Okay, now, as I tell my clients, please do not drag your mother out of the closet here. Okay, we are talking about, like, let's do workplace vulnerabilities. Okay. So what do you guys think? What do you guys think some of your biggest vulnerabilities are when you step into the workplace? It's okay, don't be shy. And I've got some people private messaging me, right? So some people are saying, what are they? Computer vulnerabilities and data security, right? Vulnerabilities around infrastructure. That's a vulnerability, right? So those are vulnerabilities, right? So then the question is your vulnerability the what, or is your vulnerability the who? Okay, because I want to pose to you that most of our vulnerabilities at work are around the who. All right, it's the people and their state of mind, and you know, some of us, depending on where we work, it's what they have access to outside work. Okay, do they have access to weaponry? What's the level of access of drugs and alcohol in your community and in the communities that they live with, right? We never talk about workplace culture as a vulnerability, but as we go through this, all these issues at their heart, all these issues in a vulnerability assessment for critical control points are created because people made decisions and did something. And they make decisions, all people make decisions based on where they're, and like what their brains are doing at that time, okay? And the goal of this work and going through these 4 basics is to mitigate the risks of being exposed to other people's decisions from a place of thinking really clearly, from a place of higher consciousness and more, frankly, thinking in our prefrontal cortex, where we make all our good decisions. For those of you who have teenagers, you know what I'm talking about, right? So there are lots of ways to describe vulnerability, right? And this is not a Brené Brown talk, though I can totally do one of those. But vulnerability, in the sense of how we are using it here, is mitigated at the end of the day through accountability. In this talk today, we're talking about a certain set of risks, but accountability mitigates vulnerability in very many broad senses. So then the question is, what's accountability, right? We all know we're supposed to be accountable. We all know that. Accountability is like what we're looking for in, you know, the people we work with, in our clients, in from the government, from our kids. But accountability really is a set of decisions and actions, like conversations, that make us uncomfortable. And that's actually what mitigates the risk. Okay. Accountability truly in any setting will mitigate risk if you think about the broad definitions of risk. So now to make this like, you guys think about this, I want you to think about a food. Maybe it's a food that you work with. Maybe it's a food that you just happen to know that's pretty vulnerable to food fraud. So I've got maple syrup here. That's one of our more vulnerable foods, right? And this particular in this particular form is especially vulnerable to food fraud, right? And I want you to like write down that on your handy piece of paper. I want you to write down what food you want to pick. Okay, lots of foods to talk about. I'm having lots of conversations in the plant-based food space, especially simulacrum proteins that I call them, plant-based dairy and cell-based meats and those sorts of things. Like, my opinion, those are pretty vulnerable to food fraud if you look at all of the criteria that we're going to be applying to them. Okay, so do something fun and be prepared to think hard and ask questions, okay? And so when I say that, though, I want you to think about how you approached your last biosecurity or food defense meeting. Okay, so these are two of my three kids. These are my boys. Zach's there on the left and Ben's there on the right. And they're at the gym. Okay, and I am super proud of myself that I have gotten my kids to go to the gym, but I get them to go to the gym, frankly, because I bribed them. And at the gym, those uprights, as you know, have YouTube. And this is how my kids have access to YouTube. I literally make them like exercise so that they can get their electronics. Right. And so for them, the exercise is a means to an end. At your last biosecurity or food defense or, meeting, how did you approach the task at hand? Is it a set of technical tasks that you have to do? Are you doing these to get them done? Okay, or are you doing them because there's a larger picture at work? And I was working with all three of my kids this morning, and they really super tidied up the front yard. They spent 3 hours doing it without killing each other, and it was pretty amazing, right? My front yard looks pretty awesome. But at the end, they're like, Mom, am I done? Can I have electronics? Mom, am I done? Can I have electronics? Right? And so at the end, they run out of emotional energy, as everybody does. And they start doing it to get it done. But when we do things to get them done, we start missing them. And as we were fond of saying around here, always takes longer to do things 2 and 3 times as opposed to doing them right on the first time. But the truth of the matter is that if you do things to get them done, it's because of work habits you formed when you were my kids' age, right? And now you can be present to those work habits and you can create new realities. But if you find yourself doing tasks to get them done, it's because of the way you started to learn to work when you were a teenager, right? And then that brings us to how most people approach most standard operating procedures, right? It's a hoop to jump through. The USDA is making us do this. The FDA is making us do this. Our SQF audit is making us do this. I have to tell you, USDA, FDA, the SQF audit, your customer, your whoever can make you do nothing. Okay, the reason you do anything in the world is because you think about doing something, you have a feeling about doing it, you do it, right? That's anybody who's been in cognitive behavioral therapy knows this, right? So is doing vulnerability assessments or really any SOP a hoop to jump through? Because I want to ask you, what is the purpose of any system that you have at work? Whether it's a VASIP system or a HACCP system, a preventive controls plan, a sanitation plan, an employee manual is a system. What's the purpose? What's the purpose of that system? I'll give you a minute to think about it. If you want to put some ideas in the chat, I will take a look at the ideas in the chat. The purpose of any system is to help the business thrive, right? In my world, even when I'm working with not-for-profits, right? Businesses of any stripe exist to create cash flow. They exist to create money. They exist for the purpose of returning economic good into the economy, because if they don't do that, they simply don't exist for very long. And you're talking to a purpose-driven CEO. I'm here to reinvent the food economy, right? So all these standard operating procedures exist to help the business thrive. So what does that actually mean? It means all of these processes and these procedures these SOPs, these risk mitigation tools belong to the company. They don't belong to the team that does it. They don't belong to the product. They don't belong to the process. They don't belong to the people. It belongs to the company. All of those things are here to work together to make the business thrive. So how do businesses thrive? Well, businesses thrive by implementing our 4 food safety basics, okay? And I'm gonna go through these, but the first food safety basic is, hang on to your hats here, people. It's think first, act second, okay? You're gonna hear two quotes from one of my professors at vet school, Dr. Scott Brown, who taught us renal physiology and internal medicine. And one of his favorite quotes was, don't just do something, stand there. Okay, think first. We always have to think first, okay? There are 12 steps in a HACCP program. This should be unsurprising considering it's based on HACCP. They mirror HACCP for a reason, because just like in HACCP, we think first. But you're gonna say, Dr. P or Michelle or whatever, the first step in HACCP is not think. The first step in HACCP is form your team. I totally understand that. Okay. But you, and we're gonna cover this in just a second, right? But you have to think about who's going to be on your team, okay? Because you know how I said that your SOPs and your processes and your procedures belong to the company? The roles on your team belong to the company. Roles don't belong to people, roles belong to companies, okay? And so you're going to form your team, right? That team is then going to get together and describe the ingredients and the foods and brainstorm their vulnerabilities. All right, we're gonna do this in a lot more depth, so don't feel the need to write all this down. And again, my email is going to be at the end. And so if you want the zip drive that I hand my clients and a video on how to actually like go through the paperwork, I will send that out to you. You're just gonna have to send me an email. Okay? You are going to describe your ingredients and foods and brainstorm their vulnerabilities. You have to describe your whole entire supply chain and the risk of fraud at every step in the supply chain. You have to then develop a process flow diagram for your incoming supplies. This can be ingredient by ingredient, so no, you're not going to get this process done fast. Please do not decide that this is like one meeting at 4 o'clock on a Thursday afternoon, because that ain't never going to work, okay? You have to validate the steps with a supplier. Okay, so we always validate our process flow diagrams. This is no different, right? Then we're actually going to do that vulnerability assessment on each step of the process, okay, in that process flow diagram. And instead of thinking about physical, chemical, microbial hazards, we are going to think about substituting, counterfeiting, and which includes like stolen goods and tampering and all that sort of stuff. Adulterating and all the many ways we can adulterate food, mislabeling, false claims, and misleading statements. Okay, now we use the word adulterate in a very specific sense in HACCP plan. I have found the words adulterated thrown about willy-nilly within biosecurity and biodefense planning. And so I think that there's room for people to misunderstand what we mean. And so I split it out this way, okay? Then once you've done your vulnerability analysis, which is a lot like your hazard analysis, we're going to determine what are the critical control points, set critical limits and do the monitoring. Then of course we verify and we validate the plan. Got to talk about record keeping, which I'm going to talk about sooner than you think. And we're going to implement, we're going to maintain the plan, right? And so what I want to impose on you, or what I want to give you is the gift that you have the ability to think first, okay? Think about this first. And that first step that we are going to think about is form your team, all right? So this is a Venn diagram of how I describe work to everybody, all right? In your job, all right, whether you are a stay-at-home parent, the CEO of a company, or somebody who's the head of a food brand or food facility, right? Everybody's job has parts where you're a technician. Everybody's job has parts where you're a manager, and everybody's job has parts where you're a leader. On your vulnerability assessments team, you probably need somebody who knows biodefense, food fraud, food defense, okay? Your security, whatever you guys do for security, like who are the security people? They actually need to be part of this, and you need to include them in the conversation and train them to the point where they can understand the process, right? And somebody just mentioned short staffing, right, in the chat, and building security. This is a big vulnerability. What if you simply don't have the bodies there to get enough diversity of thought in the room and enough different perspectives to do this well? Okay, that's a really big issue. And that's honestly when you bring in people like me, right? So then the question becomes, who's sitting in what bucket in this Venn diagram, right? Because each of these different buckets has different jobs. The people who are doing the technical work, and this it looks a lot like determining, like doing the hazard analysis, determining, and at a minimum, probably determining the critical limits after everybody talks about the CCP. And so it's the job of technicians, right, to create the data. And then it's the job of the managers to create the systems to turn that data into information. Then it's the job of the leader to take that information and turn it into actionable knowledge, which then creates more decisions and more data, and the cycle continues. So, when we talk about the 12 steps of HACCP, I often teach people to do your record keeping first. Decide what records you want first, okay? And that's literally going to be the first job at your HACCP team meeting. It's like, what information are we trying to get here, okay? Because if you don't, as you all know, if you didn't write it down, it didn't happen. So please, especially if you're going after an audit and you're doing this in conformance with SQF or BRC or another GFSI based auditing system, I want you to think about, what does that auditor need to see so that they can understand that we have fulfilled both the spirit and the letter of this item in our audit. All right, so that's, your established record keeping is, I think, step 11 of the process, but generally we do it right after we form the team, okay? So we think first and we act second, okay? So the team's gonna get together, and I want you to describe your ingredients and the foods, right? So usually we start with foods and then we break it down to ingredients, and you got to brainstorm their vulnerabilities, okay? Then you've got to describe your supply chain and the risk of food fraud within your supply chain, okay? And sometimes this is different. I have a client and they are an oil company in Long Island City. And I tell you what, everybody, I promise you we're all in the wrong business. The best business to be in is to take large quantities of commodity items and turn them into small quantities of commodity items, and you will make millions and millions and millions of dollars every year. And even your preventive maintenance guy is going to drive a Porsche, because that's what happens at this facility. Super nice people, and they make a lot of money. All right. But there is a significant risk of food fraud with them, okay? Because of what they do, right? And so we want to think first and we want to act second. Act in this sense means writing. It means taking what you're thinking, writing it down, evaluating it, go back and keep thinking about it. Because as I tell my clients, this is not the revealed word of God, okay? Even Tolstoy, when he was writing War and Peace, got super angry at himself, because when he would take a scene in a Russian salon, describing all the language and the body language and the costuming and the settings and all of that sort of stuff, he would get furious at himself because he always felt like he was lying because it wasn't accurate. I have seen people do that to themselves with their standard operating procedures. I promise. The process of writing is rewriting. You don't have to get this right the first time, okay? And so this actually brings us to the second of our food safety basics, right? which is schedule your work and show up and do it. Okay, everything in you should see my calendar. Everything in my calendar is completely scheduled out, right? So the question is when does everybody need to come together to do this? Frankly, having done this an awful lot, I think scheduling that everybody has certain milestones that they have to meet and do this over Slack or another set of email kinds of, electronic communication for people is, I think, probably a better way to do this. And I think it should probably just take a month, right? That being said, you're going to want to calendar some meetings, right? You're going to need meetings to develop a process flow diagram, because I don't know anybody who can do that accurately all by themselves. It's you and Post-it notes and like the other people on the team. Okay, that's how we process flow diagram, especially because these are supply chain process flow diagrams. And if you're actually in the plant, not everybody knows what the supply chain actually is, right? So you're probably going to have to sit all together in some way of actually breathing the same air, God forbid, right? Or using, the equivalent of Post-it notes over Zoom meetings, right? So you're going to need meetings for that. You're going to need to schedule validating these steps with your supplier, right? You actually have to talk to your supplier and see if what you've said is accurate. So that generally requires a phone conversation, and people generally like to have those scheduled, right? Then at the end, we're going to verify and validate the plan, okay? When are you going to review the paperwork that you created, and when are you going to do after action reviews? We're going to talk more about after action reviews, but when you're verifying and validating, right, and then implementing and maintaining the plan, which I think are steps 10 and 12 respectively, you need to set time with other brains to do this. Other human beings need to help you do this, and generally we do that in meetings, okay? So that should give you an idea of about the time commitment that you need to get this done, okay? So we scheduled our work, and now we actually have to do it, right? So when you're describing your ingredients and your foods and brainstorming their vulnerabilities, how do you do that? Well, Google is your friend, okay? The listservs that you are part of are your friend. I'm confident I could send something out to our food safety and public health vets listserv and get some really good answers. I'm confident about this because I do it, right? And I'm sure like your colleagues can really, really help you with this, right? Especially if you don't know your whole supply chain, okay? And then the question is around your supply chain, how far back is your supply chain described, right? Do you know what is in the process flow diagram for those incoming supplies? And does anybody know the steps of the supply chain? This is a great opportunity to develop deeper relationships with your suppliers, okay? And talk to them and say, okay, we're doing a vulnerability assessment, and I'm wondering, they're going to be very proprietary around who they use, but I've never met a supplier that isn't willing to talk to me about what the steps actually are, okay? Because usually they take a lot of pride in that, right? As they should, right? They're a supply chain company. They work really hard, right? But you're gonna have to actually talk to people and get that. If you don't get your process flow diagram accurate, it's like anything else. If you don't know what steps you're gonna do, you're not gonna end up doing the analysis correctly because you're gonna miss things, all right? And so then when we talk about doing the work, we got to talk about what is that work? What are the steps of a vulnerability analysis for critical control points? Well, we formed our team. We've picked our food, right? I didn't really talk about who this is for, but I did in some respects. So this can be for the FDA, it can be for an audit, and it can be to really protect the business, right? These are designed so businesses can thrive. Talked about process flow diagramming and validating, right? In a HACCP plan, you sign off on the process flow diagram. Well, the equivalent is you talk to your suppliers, okay? So now we're going to talk about doing each one of each one of the vulnerabilities, okay? And the first vulnerability is substitution, right? Olive oil is probably the poster child for substitution as part of economically motivated adulteration. And if you guys have other experiences as I am going through these, this is where we share information, right? And we educate each other so that our food supply is safer. Okay, so feel free to tell me in the chat other substitution things that you have seen, because there are a lot. Okay, especially if you have a zebra, I totally want to hear it. Because this is what happens, and this is what happened to me. I was out at a client's. He does buffalo and like wild game meats and things like that, and he was super excited. And it was the middle of winter, and so we couldn't go outside and grill, so we were cooking inside. And he had gotten a bottle of canola oil, okay, because he likes to cook it in a very neutral oil with a high heat point. And he starts cooking it, and like, I tell you what, my VRBO like filled up with smoke. Absolutely filled up with smoke. And we were like, what the heck is going on? And we had dinner, and there was beer and wine. It was all really good. And then I got to looking at the oil while we were cleaning up, and I was like, you know what? I bet they substituted a cheaper, like a soya oil or something in here, because there's no canola oil that I know of that will burn at the temperatures that we were cooking. So, and then somebody put in here the methyl alcohol deaths, right? So substituting methanol for ethanol, that's a really big deal. That is not good, okay? So, and these things can have, in my case, it was a smoky VRBO and, desperately opening the doors in the kind of frigid Wyoming temperatures. But substituting methyl alcohol for ethyl alcohol has some dramatically different outcomes, right? So the next vulnerability, counterfeiting, stolen goods, and tampering, right? We all know who the Tylenol killer is, right? Maybe this is where some of us decided we were getting into regulatory medicine. But where do we see counterfeiting and the most, right? I have a picture of a horse, right? There's the horse meat scandal, and I swear it's like scandals. It keeps coming out. But counterfeiting is huge in fisheries. Okay, and this can have pretty significant allergen implications, right? That's a really big deal. If you think you are using one kind of fish and it's actually another kind of fish, people have different allergies. It can be very, very different and very, very challenging, right? So stolen goods, that is, you're going to talk about economically motivated adulteration. It's still doing the wrong thing to the food supply. And who the heck knows, do stolen goods really comply with sanitary transport plans? I suspect no, right? And so there is lots of, yes, so sounds like mislabeling. Is it mislabeling? And we're going to get to that. Is it mislabeling, or is it substituting? And this is where you have to use your professional judgment, right? And just because one company said this was a substitution, if it was a substitution and not a fraud like that and mislabel, right? Or is it just a mislabel? You've got to make those decisions, and this is why you need a team, right? And so that's why we do it this way, is we do it in team, and we do it over the course of about a month, so that you can get all of those thoughts out there, right? Adulterating, right? I want everybody to sing Master of the House from Les Mis here, because we water the wine and we make up the weight. This has been true as long as people have been serving food in food establishments. Food establishments have been diluting out the product, taking water and adding it to something more expensive so you can stretch it out, all right? And this diluting things out absolutely happens. And the question is, with what? How do you do it? Right? How is it happening? And does it have any other effects on the other kinds of vulnerability assessments, like Now on little, are we gonna go? There we go. There we go. Like mislabeling. Okay. So coffee is usually the example that people use with mislabeling. Right? Much of the coffee is not from the country identified on the label. I have my doubts that the Ethiopian Yeager Chief coffee that's sitting at Giant Eagle over there, that's being sold for $6.99 a pound, has anything except a passing resemblance to the country of Ethiopia. I really don't think so. All right, and so this happens because the companies can add these labels, and the consumer perceives a quality factor that is not actually there. Okay, so that's mislabeling. You can also mislabel on your nutrition facts. Okay, and I am not talking about, you have one small bag of chips and you divide it into 4 servings, right? Because everybody in the history of eating potato chips has only eaten 4, right? That's not mislabeling. That's like, in my head, lousy communication with your customer, right? But people can actually mislabel, and I have seen it in dietary fiber and sugars. So they are misrepresenting how much what do they call it? Insoluble fiber, right? Because they want more of that keto feel, and they want people to say, no, this is like clean, and it gets into that whole like, sugar is cocaine conversation, which I'm really kind of not here for. All right, so that's mislabeling. That's the vulnerability associated with mislabeling. Okay, the next one is false claims and misleading statements. Okay, there are organic certifications out there that have nothing to do with the idea of actually doing something organic. Okay, there was a scandal in China where people were buying their organic certifications. This is the one that kills me is I do a lot of foreign supplier verification programming, right? And as part of that, I read a lot of sanitation standard operating procedures from overseas companies. And I know that they are, and I'm not auditing their organic label, right? They have an organic audit to do that. But I'm like looking at their SSOP, and I'm looking at what they're using. And if you tell me that you're organic certified and you have a Quat sanitizer in your sanitation standard operating procedure, I'm gonna have some questions. I'm really gonna have some questions, right? And so with the proliferation of labels, right, there was a study, I don't know, 5 years ago or something, that said it takes an average of 3 labels, like organic or local or your state, whatever your state ag and markets label is, for a consumer's eye to be drawn to your package. And I think what that means is that we've got a lot of false claims and misleading statements on here. Okay, I think a lot of packaging has false claims and misleading statements. So if your supply chain includes foods with label attribution, yes, I know USDA FSIS requires having documentation. I would really tell you that you're at a pretty significant vulnerability unless you're actually going to some of these places, doing boots on the ground, okay? Because that gets us into the third of our food safety basics, which is, sorry, my PowerPoint is not being particularly good, right? Which is always be observing, okay? Nothing substitutes for going to see your suppliers. Now, I recognize in the world of coronavirus, that can be incredibly complicated, but getting out to the Philippines, not a particularly easy task, right? I understand that, right? But if you want to validate your steps with the supplier, being there to observe your supplier, there's almost no substitute for that, to use the word, right? Because this brings us to the next quote from Dr. Scott Brown: you miss more by not looking than by not knowing, right? So you've got to validate these steps with your suppliers. That's a process of observation. You've got to validate your hazard analysis. You got to look at it and you got to sit down and let it process and let yourself think. And then when you have done that and validated with your suppliers that you got all the steps, wrote your hazard analysis, probably rewrote it, and then you got to sit down and you got to think about what are your critical control points. Okay, and I want you to remember the definition of a critical control point. If y'all haven't been in a HACCP class for a hot minute, a critical control point is defined as a step at which a control can be applied and is essential to prevent or eliminate a food safety hazard or reduce it to an acceptable level. Okay, so, but when we think about, here's the issue, and this is why it gets back to accountability. When we think about the steps that have to happen to substitute horse meat for beef, to substitute skate for scallops, to substitute a cheaper oil for olive oil, to substitute corn syrup and food coloring for honey, or corn syrup, water, and food coloring for maple syrup, or to label your maple syrup from Ohio, because we're actually the largest maple syrup producing state in the country, as real Canadian maple syrup and all those things. There's people that make those decisions, okay? So when you're determining your critical control points and your critical limits, these are not going to be as cut and dry as some of the ones. This is not a cooking critical control point. This is not a stabilization critical control point. This is much more like a sanitation preventive control, where we say visibly clean meets the critical limit, right? You're gonna have critical limits like that, and that's okay. It's a process of being comfortable with the discomfort of having not quite as cut and dry critical limits as you might want. Okay, but it's a way to improve your brain function, is to be comfortable with discomfort, right? But the important thing is, getting back to record keeping, is to document your reasoning. Are you keeping decision-making documentation around this? Because I assure you, when the lawyers come, if something happens to you, right, y'all are going to definitely want that decision-making documentation that says, we didn't consider something as a vulnerability, or we did consider it as a vulnerability and we considered it in this way, right? You have to document that stuff, all right? And you have to document it by observing what you guys are thinking. That is what a decision-making documentation is. It's like your observations on your own thinking around your decisions, right? So once you have your CCPs and your critical limits, of course, we start thinking about monitoring. Now, hopefully you did your record keeping first, and you were thinking about what's going to give us metrics that make sense and monitoring documentation that makes sense, because your monitoring has to create accountability. If you miss a monitoring, it's the same thing as missing a critical control point, because you didn't document it. If you didn't write it down, it didn't actually happen. Okay, so you got to determine your monitoring and allow that monitoring to create accountability. But of course, accountability is a conversation. Accountability is decision-making. Accountability is being uncomfortable with other people and saying, did you do what you said you were going to do? And if not, why not? Right? And then that gets us to the fourth and final food safety basic, right? Where we verify and validate the plan, and we implement and maintain that plan. But what is verification? Verification is asking, did we do what we said we were going to do? And validation is what we did helpful to actually do what we want, to actually mitigate the risk, right? The only way I know how to do that is through after action reporting. Now, all of my Army people here, I am not quite talking about it to the depth that we used to do it in the Army, right? I have a very simple three-set question for after action reporting. What worked? Okay. How are we going to keep doing what worked? What didn't work? What are you going to stop doing, not do the next time that you go through this exercise? So, right? Then finally, what are you going to do differently next year now that you know more, now that you've done this for a year or two, now that you can have new ways of thinking about it, now that you've attended continuing education here and other places around biosecurity and food defense, what are you going to do differently with your VACCP plan while you do this? Okay. And then the real question is, and here's the kicker, did you meet the mission of the business while you were doing this? Because the mission of the business is to thrive in the marketplace and create profit. I want you to take any SOP that you've ever written and ask yourself that question. And if you can't answer that in the affirmative, why does that SOP exist? Okay? Because that's really our job. When we're implementing these programs and these projects, our job is to make sure that the plans and programs and the people we manage and the people we lead allow the business to thrive. That is how we create continuous process improvement. All right, my friends, that is what I have for you. We've got time for questions here. There is my email, michelle@dirigofoodsafety.com. Dirigo is Latin for I lead, because we are leading the way to safer food here. So write that down. That is my cell phone. If you call me on my cell phone, I will pick up, though not now because I'm on airplane mode. And then I do a lot of writing on LinkedIn. So I would love to connect with you on LinkedIn. Pretty sure I'm the only Michelle Fannenstiel doing regulatory medicine on LinkedIn, and you can find me talking about all sorts of fun things around the universe of food safety and leadership and food businesses. Okay, put links in the chat. So I wonder if, oops, end of slideshow. Here, I know my own, here, let me end the slideshow, stop sharing. And here we go.
And while you're doing, are there any questions of Dr. Fannenstiel? Either type them into the Q&A feature, or we can get fancy and I can, if you can raise your hand in Zoom, I can activate your microphone.
Looks like I did. All right, well then, I think Dr. Turing and I will give you 8 minutes back in your day. You haven't read Thank You for Being Late by Tom Friedman. Highly recommend it. But we'll give you some time back. Thanks so much for coming. And if you have any questions, please come find me on LinkedIn. I'm super easy to find. And for those of you who are coming to AVMA, I'll be doing a version of this at AVMA. It's not going to be quite the same thing. It'll be much more workshopy. So I will see you in Philadelphia
in July. All right. Thank you once again, Dr. Fannenstiel, and I will be in touch with you. I appreciate all the attendees. And with that, I will wish everyone a great afternoon and evening, wherever you may be. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.